call upon the mountain spirits. The wind hears my voice.
The Healing Heart, a native woman's journey. From grief to new dawn. A sleep story for peaceful rest. Montana Territory. Winter, 1887. Natóyi-nii'tákim awoke to the whisper of snow falling on cedar bark. The soft sound, barely audible yet unmistakable, transported her back to childhood, to her grandmother's lodge where she had learned the old ways, where smoke from the fire had curled upward through the opening in the buffalo hide walls, carrying prayers to the sky, where Natóyi-nii'tákim's weathered hands had taught her which plants healed and which harmed, which songs brought peace and which called upon the spirits for protection. But that world was gone now, scattered like ashes on the wind. Natóyi-nii'tákim had crossed to the spirit world 10 winters past. Her mother Omoxi-Puma had followed 5 years later, and the old ways, the ways of the Blackfoot people, were fading like morning mist under the harsh sun of the reservation system the government had imposed. She lay still for a moment longer, listening to the profound silence that only comes when fresh snow has blanketed everything. In this stillness, she could almost hear the voices of those who had passed, almost feel their presence in the spaces between heartbeats. She reached out instinctively, her hand searching for warmth that was no longer there for Ponoka-Omita, who would never again wake beside her. 3 winters. 3 long winters since Ponoka-Omita and their daughter Nii'tákim had left this world, taken by the spotted sickness that swept through their small community like an invisible enemy more deadly than any crow raid. Ponoka-Omita, with his gentle hands and quiet wisdom, who had been a respected hunter and warrior among the Blackfoot people, a man who could track elk through snow and speak to horses with his spirit. Nii'tákim, with her bright laughter and dancing feet, who had been only 6 summers old when the fever claimed her small body. Natóyi-nii'tákim rose from her sleeping mat, wrapping a worn blanket around her shoulders. The blanket had been woven by Omoxi-Puma during the last good year, before the buffalo disappeared from the plains and the old life became impossible. Before the treaties that were made to be broken, before her people were forced onto lands where the earth would not yield food, where the government made promises written on paper that dissolved like snow in spring rain. The cabin felt cold, the fire having burned down to coals during the night. She would need to rebuild it to bring warmth back to this space that often felt as frozen as her heart. This cabin stood on land that had belonged to her family since time beyond memory. 20 acres beside the river, protected by ancient pines, where her ancestors had camped during their seasonal rounds for countless generations. It was all that remained of the vast territory her people had once traveled freely, following the buffalo from the mountains to the plains and back again with the turning of the seasons. Ponoka-Omita had built this cabin here 7 summers ago, after they married in the traditional way. He had honored her family's connection to this place, understanding that for the Blackfoot people, the land was not something you owned, but something you belonged to. The cabin blended both worlds. Log walls like the white settlers built for winter protection, but a smoke hole in the roof, like the traditional lodges, so prayers could still rise to the sky. The government Indian agent wanted even this small piece of land, wanted to move her to the reservation where the rest of her band had been forced to go 5 winters past. There they lived in wooden houses that felt like prisons, forbidden to hunt. The few remaining buffalo forbidden to hold the sun dance and other sacred ceremonies, forced to cut their hair and wear white man's clothes, forced to farmland that would not yield crops because the agent chose the wrong location, dependent on government beef rations that rarely came and were often spoiled when they did. She had refused to go. This land was sacred, holding the spirits of her ancestors. Ponoka-Omita was buried here beneath the ancient cottonwood tree by the river, his grave marked with stones, painted with red ochre, in the traditional way, his medicine bundle and favorite bow placed beside him for his journey to the sand hills where the dead go. Nii'tákim rested beside him, their spirits together in the next world. How could she abandon them? How could she leave this place where the spirits of 7 generations of her family walked? But staying came at a cost. She lived between 2 worlds belonging fully to neither. The people on the reservation said she was foolish to stay alone, that she should accept the new ways as they had been forced to. The white settlers in the town of Timber Creek saw her as an obstacle, a stubborn Indian woman refusing to surrender the last piece of land they wanted. Alone, except for the memories and the forest, and the spirits who still walked here. Natóyi-nii'tákim dressed carefully against the cold. First, the deerskin leggings she had made herself tanned with the brain of the deer, and smoked over willow fire until they were soft as cloth, and waterproof decorated with porcupine quill work in the patterns. Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her geometric designs that told the story of her family's clan. Over these, she pulled a wool skirt dark blue, a practical adaptation to the changing world. A cotton blouse covered by the elk-hide vest that Omoxi-Puma had made during her last winter, every bead placed with prayers, creating patterns of mountains and rivers, of eagles and wolves, of the connection between all living things. Her hair, still long and thick despite being streaked now with silver at the temples, she braided carefully. In the old days, a woman's hair was her power, her beauty, her connection to earth and sky. Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her that a woman's hair held her thoughts and prayers, that cutting it was done only in mourning. She tied the braid with red cloth, the color of life, of blood, of the sacred. Around her neck, she wore a medicine bundle on a leather cord given to her by Natóyi-nii'tákim when she became a woman. It contained sage, gathered at dawn, a small crystal from the high mountains, a tiny bit of earth from the place of her birth, and locks of hair from each person she had loved and lost. She touched it briefly, drawing strength from its presence. The cabin itself was small but well built, constructed by Ponokaomita, with help from his brother Xixtapi and their cousin Natóyi-nii'tákim during their first year together. Ponokaomita had been skilled with his hands, able to build in both the traditional ways and the new style the settlers used. The walls were thick logs, chinked with a mixture of mud and moss that kept out the fiercest winds. The floor was hard-packed earth, covered with buffalo robes and woven rush mats. A single room served as kitchen, living space, and sleeping quarters, though Ponokaomita had planned to add rooms when children came. Now those rooms would never be built. Along one wall hung bundles of healing plants she had gathered during the warmer months. Sage for cleansing and protection. Sweetgrass for blessing and peace, its braids filling the cabin with vanilla scent when burned. Yarrow for wounds and bleeding. Willow bark for pain and fever. Echinacea for strengthening the body against sickness. Elderberry for winter coughs. Bare root for spiritual protection and strength. Dozens of others, each with its own medicine, its own spirit, its own purpose. Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her the names and uses of hundreds of plants, knowledge passed down through countless generations of healers. Her grandmother had been a respected medicine woman, called upon for difficult births, for healing battle wounds, for driving away evil spirits that caused madness. Natóyi-nii'tákim carried that knowledge, now the last keeper of her grandmother's wisdom. The white settlers called her the medicine woman, or sometimes the Indian doctor, the titles spoken with a mixture of fear, suspicion, and grudging respect. Some whispered that she practiced dark magic, that she consorted with spirits. The town's preacher, Reverend Blackwell, had preached sermons against her, calling the old ways heathen superstition and warning his congregation to avoid her. When her treatment succeeded where the white doctor failed, they took the healing without thanks, as if the plants themselves had worked with no skill or knowledge required. When her treatments failed, as sometimes they must, because not all sickness can be cured, they blamed her, claimed she had cursed the patient rather than healed them, whispered that Indian medicine was really Indian witchcraft. Few dared come to her door anymore, and those who did came in desperation when Dr. Harrison in town had given up hope, when a child's fever would not break, or a wound had become poisoned despite the doctor's treatments. She turned no one away despite how the settlers had treated her people, despite their theft of the land and their slaughter of the buffalo that had sustained her people for generations beyond counting. Healing was her calling, her gift from the Creator, the duty that came with the knowledge Natóyi-nii'tákim had passed to her. She honored it regardless of whether the sick person honored her or her people. On the wooden shelf above the fireplace sat a small altar arranged with careful intention. A tin-type photograph of Pono-ka-Omata, taken by a traveling photographer 3 summers before his death. In the image, he wore his traditional clothing, buckskin shirt decorated with quill work, and his hair long and loose around his shoulders, adorned with the eagle feathers he had earned through acts of courage and generosity. His strong, handsome face looked solemn, as the photographer required, but Natóyi-nii'tákim could still see the warmth in his eyes, the kindness that had drawn her to him. Beside the photograph sat Nii'tákim's favorite toy, a small horse carved from cottonwood by Pono-ka-Omata's father, and dressed in a tiny saddle and blanket Natóyi-nii'tákim had beaded. A sacred pipe that had belonged to Pono-ka-Omata's grandfather, earned in Vision Quest and passed down through the men of his family. An eagle feather powerful and sacred given to Pono-ka-Omata by his uncle, a holy man. A small leather pouch containing earth from the place where the buffalo had last been seen in great numbers before the white hunters came with their rifles and shot thousands for their hides alone, leaving the meat to rot, killing the sacred animals that had given the Blackfoot everything: food, shelter, clothing, tools. She knelt now before this altar, lighting a braid of sweetgrass with a match, watching the smoke curl upward, carrying her prayers. She closed her eyes and spoke softly in the Blackfoot language words that felt both ancient and immediate on her tongue. She prayed for Pono-ka-Omata and Nii'tákim, that their spirits were at peace in the sandhills, that they watched over her still from the spirit world. She prayed for strength to face another day alone. She prayed for wisdom to know her path forward when the government pressed harder to take even this small piece of land that was all she had left. She prayed to the Creator, to the Sun, to the spirits of this place who had known her family since the beginning time. The prayer finished, she set the sweetgrass in an abalone shell to burn out safely, then rose and began her morning tasks. The fire needed building, so she added pine needles and small twigs to the coals, blowing gently until flames appeared, then adding larger pieces of pine. The wood crackled and popped, releasing its sweet, resinous scent into the cabin. She filled her iron kettle with water from the wooden bucket by the door, water she had hauled from the river yesterday, and hung it over the fire to boil. While waiting for the water to heat, she ground coffee beans in her hand, milled the rhythmic motion meditative. Coffee was a taste she had acquired from the traders who came to the Blackfoot camps in her youth, before everything changed. It was one of the few things from the white world she had embraced. She would add herbs to it sometimes, mint or sage, making it her own, honoring both the new and the old. As the coffee brewed, filling the cabin with its rich, bitter aroma, she prepared a simple breakfast. Pemmican made last autumn from dried elk meat berries and rendered fat, traditional food that would sustain her through the hardest work. A piece of fry bread left from yesterday. It was humble food but nourishing, made with her own hands from what the land provided and what little she could trade for in town. She ate slowly, sitting at the small table Pono-ka-Omata had made from pine, remembering mornings when 3 people had gathered here. Pono-ka-Omata, teaching Nii'tákim the stories of their people, his deep voice filling the cabin with tales of Old Man the Trickster, who created the world and taught the people how to live. Nii'tákim, asking endless questions in her high, sweet voice, her small hands always moving, always creating something. Tiny horses from clay dolls, from grass patterns in the dirt. The silence now was deafening. Sometimes it pressed on her like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. After breakfast, she cleaned her few dishes with sand and water, then banked the fire carefully so it would burn steadily while she was out. She needed to check her fish traps in the river and gather more firewood before the next storm came. The signs were clear, the way the jays were calling, the smell in the air, the color of the sky. A big storm was coming, perhaps by nightfall. Living alone, especially as a woman in this harsh land, required constant vigilance, constant work. There was no rest, no luxury of letting tasks wait for another day. If she did not prepare, she might not survive. She stepped onto the small porch Pono-ka-Omata had built, surveying the land as the sun climbed higher, painting the snow with gold and rose. 20 acres of forest and meadow beside the river, protected by ancient pines that had stood for centuries, that had been saplings when her ancestors first came to this valley generations ago. This was sacred ground where her people had gathered for the autumn salmon runs, where they had held ceremonies under the full moon, where young men went to seek visions, and young women came for their womanhood ceremonies, where the spirits too of the land were strong and watchful. She knew every tree, every rock, every turn of the river. She knew where the deer made their trails and where the elk came to drink at dawn. She knew where the bears denned in winter and where the eagles nested in summer. She knew where the best medicine plants grew. The bare root in the high meadows, the kinnikinick on the sunny slopes, the sweet pine in the deep forest. This knowledge had been passed to her by Natóyi-nii'tákim, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers back through the generations to the ancient grandmothers who first learned the secrets of the plants, from the plants themselves, who spoke to them in dreams and visions. This land was not just property to her, as it was to the settlers who measured it and drew lines on paper and claimed ownership. It was alive, breathing, conscious. It had spirit and deserved respect. It was family. It was all that remained of the vast territory her people had once called home, thousands upon thousands of acres, that stretched from the mountains to the plains, from the northern ice to the southern deserts, all taken by treaties and broken promises and simple theft. Victor Blackwood wanted this land. His logging company, Blackwood Timber Company, had already claimed most of the valley, his massive saws destroying the old growth forests that had stood since time beyond memory. Trees that had taken 300 years to grow were cut down in minutes, their bodies dragged away by teams of oxen to become lumber for houses in distant cities, profit for Blackwood's ever-expanding empire. The sound of those saws haunted her dreams, sometimes a constant screaming that seemed to echo the pain of the forest itself. She had watched the mountainsides, once thick with timber, become scarred and barren, the soil washing away in spring rains with no roots to hold it. Had seen the rivers run cloudy with sawdust and debris, the fish dying floating belly up in water, too poisoned to sustain life. Had watched animals, deer, elk, bears, confused and displaced, wander into areas where they didn't belong. Their ancient patterns disrupted, their food sources destroyed. It was like watching her people's destruction happen again, but to the land itself. The same pattern. Take everything, destroy what sustained life, leave nothing but scars and grief. Blackwood's men had come to her door 3 times in recent months. First, they had offered money, paper bills, they thought she would value. Though what use had she for money when there was nothing she wanted that it could buy? When she refused, explaining in both English and Blackfoot that this land was sacred, that it held the bones of her family, that it was not for sale at any price, they had laughed. Indians don't own land, one of them had said. You're just squatting here. Mr. Blackwood is being generous, even offering to pay you. The second visit had brought more money and veiled threats. A woman alone in these mountains, especially an Indian woman, faces many dangers, the foreman Wade Carson had said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. Accidents happen. Cabins catch fire. Wild animals attack. It would be safer for you on the reservation with your people. The third visit had been more direct. Sign over the land or we'll have the Indian agent force you to the reservation. You've got no rights here, no protection. Blackwood owns the territorial governor, the sheriff, the Indian agent. You've got no one. Natóyi-nii'tákim had stood in her doorway, Ponokaomita's Winchester rifle in her hands, the one he had bought with 2 winters' worth of furs, the one he had taught her to shoot, saying that a woman alone needed to be able to protect herself and provide for herself. She had told them clearly in English, so there would be no misunderstanding. This earth holds the spirits of my ancestors for 7 generations. It holds the bones of my husband and daughter. The Creator gave us this land to care for, not to own. I will die here before I leave, and my spirit will join those already here in protecting this place. Tell Blackwood that Natóyi-nii'tákim does not fear his threats. The spirits are more powerful than any white man's money or influence. They had left, but their eyes had promised they would return. Men like Blackwood did not accept refusal from anyone, much less from an Indian woman. He was powerful, wealthy, connected to the territorial government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He had the law on his side, such as it was. What chance did one Blackfoot widow have against such power? But she would not leave, could not leave. This land was all she had left of the world that had been of the life her people had lived for countless generations before the settlers came with their hunger for land and gold and timber. Every tree, every stone, every bend in the river held memories not just of her own life, but of Natóyi-nii'tákim's life and Omoxie-Puma's and their mothers before them, back through the generations to the beginning time, when the Creator made the world and taught the people how to live in balance with all things. Here Ponokaw had taught her to set fish traps in the traditional way, weaving willow branches with prayers, asking the fish to give themselves for the people's survival. Here Nii'tákim had collected smooth stones from the river, arranging them in patterns that told stories without words. Here their laughter had once echoed across the water, mixing with the songs of birds and the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the sound of life, continuing as it had for generations. She would die before she let Blackwood destroy this place. Natóyi-nii'tákim shouldered her gathering basket, checking that her knife was secure at her belt. The knife had belonged to Ponokaw, a beautiful piece with a blade of good steel, traded from a white trapper, and a handle carved from elk antler, decorated with brass tacks in the pattern of the 7 star. She had kept it sharp, honoring his memory by maintaining his tools properly. She also took her walking stick, a sturdy length of oak that 6 Stapiai had carved for her, after Ponokaw's death, decorated with symbols of protection. Bears for strength, eagles for vision, wolves for endurance. The snow was deep, coming nearly to her knees in places where the wind had drifted it, but she had snowshoes hung by the door. Traditional ones made from willow branches and rawhide, shaped and woven in the pattern Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her. She strapped them on her fingers, working the leather ties with practiced ease despite the cold. Then she set out into the forest, leaving the cabin behind, leaving human concerns behind, entering the world of tree and stone and river where older laws govern. The trees closed around her like old friends, like relatives welcoming her home. Here, among the pines and firs, the aspens and cottonwoods, she found peace that eluded her in the cabin. The forest made no judgments. It didn't care about reservations or land deeds or laws made by men in distant cities. It didn't care who was Indian and who was white, who was Christian, and who followed the old ways. It simply was eternal and accepting, governed by the ancient patterns of season and weather, of growth and death and growth again. Here she was simply part of the whole, one creature among many, all connected in the great circle of life. The trees breathed out so she could breathe in. The water fed all living things. The earth held and sustained them all. In the forest, she remembered who she was beyond the grief and loneliness, beyond the identity of widow or Indian or medicine woman. She was simply herself, a human being, connected to all other beings, part of the sacred web that held all creation together. The snow revealed tracks everywhere, stories written in white for those who could read them. Deer had passed through recently, their delicate hoofprints clear in the powder, heading downslope toward the river, where the willows provided winter browse. A fox had hunted here during the night, its trail leading from tree to tree in a zigzag pattern as it searched for mice tunneling beneath the snow. Ravens had landed and taken off again, leaving wing marks in the snow, like the sweep of a fan carrying away some bit of food to cache for later. A coyote had trotted along the ridge, confident and unhurried perhaps, heading back to its den after a successful hunt. She read these tracks like others read books, understanding the stories they told of movement and survival, of the constant dance of predator and prey that kept the world in balance, that kept any one kind from becoming too many. This was the wisdom of the Creator's design, that all things were connected, that all things kept each other in balance, that nothing was wasted, that death fed life in an eternal cycle. She made her way down to the river, following a trail she had walked thousands of times. In summer, this path was soft, with pine needles and moss flowers blooming in the dappled shade. In winter, it required careful navigation around ice-slicked rocks and snow-hidden deadfalls. But she moved with the confidence of someone who knew every step, whose feet had learned the way by heart, whose body remembered even when her mind wandered. The river was partially frozen ice, extending from both banks in shelf formations that grew thicker each night. But the center still flowed, water-black and swift, over smooth stones worn round by centuries of current. In spring, this river would rage with snowmelt powerful enough to move boulders. In summer, it would run low and clear, perfect for fishing. In autumn, the salmon would return from the ocean, fighting their way upstream to spawn and dye their bodies, feeding the forest, their children continuing the cycle. Now, in the dead of winter, it was quiet and deep, holding its breath under the ice, waiting for spring's release. Here, she had set her fish traps, clever designs of woven willow that Ponokaomita had taught her to make, that his father had taught him, that his father's father had taught him, patterns passed down through the generations since the ancient times. The traps were shaped like baskets, with funnels that allowed fish to swim in but made it difficult for them to find their way out. They were placed in the current, where fish naturally swam, checked daily in winter, several times a day in the better seasons. She checked each trap carefully, singing softly as she worked, thanking the water spirits for their generosity, apologizing for the disturbance to their realm. The first trap was empty, but the second held 2 fine trout, their scales glinting like jewels, even in the gray winter light, their bodies still strong and fat despite the cold season. She offered a prayer of thanks in the Blackfoot language, acknowledging the sacrifice of the fish, promising to use them well and waste nothing, asking them to tell their spirit kin that she was respectful, that their gift would not be squandered. This was the old way, the respectful way that Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her. You did not take without thanking. You did not waste what had been given. Every creature had spirit, deserved honor, deserved acknowledgement of its sacrifice. The fish gave their bodies so she could live. That was sacred. That required gratitude and care. The white people took without thinking, killed without thanking, wasted freely, because they saw animals and plants as things rather than relatives. That was why their relationship with the land was one of destruction rather than balance. She killed the fish quickly with a sharp blow to the head, using a smooth river stone, minimizing their suffering, as Ponokaomita had taught her. Death should be swift and clean, with respect for the spirit departing. Then, she reset the traps carefully, making sure they were secure, and placed the fish in her basket, covering them with snow to keep them fresh for the walk home. As she worked, she became aware that the forest had grown quiet. Too quiet. The birds that had been calling moments before, the chickadees, with their cheerful song, the nuthatches climbing head down along tree trunks, had fallen silent. The ravens that had been conversing in their deep, intelligent voices had stopped mid-sentence. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. In her years in these mountains, in the decades of wisdom passed down from Natóyi-nii'tákim, she had learned to read such signs. Silence in the forest often meant a predator was near. She straightened slowly, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. Her eyes scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for any sign of what had caused the warning hush. Bears should be sleeping now, deep in their winter dens, slowed by hibernation. Mountain lions were possible. The big cats were always dangerous, always silent, always unexpected. That left wolves, and wolves had been growing bolder as the settlers' hunting and the destruction of habitat reduced their natural prey of deer and elk. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of coming storm from the north. Dark clouds had been gathering on the horizon when she left the cabin, and now they were moving faster than she had anticipated, swallowing the morning sky like a living thing, turning the world from gray to darker gray. The temperature was dropping rapidly. She could feel it in the way the air bit at her exposed skin, in the way her breath formed thicker clouds, in the way the snow beneath her feet became more granular and hard, less forgiving. She needed to return home quickly, before the storm hit in full force. Winter storms in the mountains could be deadly, burying familiar landmarks under feet of snow, erasing trails, turning the familiar into a white wilderness, where even those who knew the land well could lose their way and freeze to death mere yards from safety. Natóyi-nii'tákim had told her stories of experienced hunters caught by sudden storms, found frozen days later just out of sight of their camps. That's when she heard it. A cry of pain, raw and desperate, distinctly human. The voice of someone facing death, followed immediately by the chorus of wolves, hunting, their howls rising and falling in a primitive song older than human memory. A sound that connected this moment to every winter hunt since the beginning of time, since the Creator made wolf to hunt and keep the deer herds strong. Natóyi-nii'tákim froze, her heart pounding, torn between instinct and duty. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to return to her cabin and bar the door. Wolves rarely attacked humans. She knew this, had been taught this, had lived alongside them all her life without incident. But a pack in the grip of bloodlust, having already brought down prey, blood hot in their mouths, was unpredictable. Dangerous beyond measure. Even Ponokalmata, a skilled hunter and warrior, had treated hunting wolves with great respect and caution. But that cry had been human. Someone was out there injured, being hunted. She could not simply turn away, could not leave another human being to die torn apart by wolf fangs, no matter how natural and necessary wolves hunting was. It went against everything. Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her everything she believed about the responsibility that came with being a healer, with carrying the medicine knowledge. If you have the power to help and do not use it, Natóyi-nii'tákim had told her many times, you break the sacred trust. The medicine will leave you. She had made her choice before she fully realized it, running toward the sound rather than away, her snowshoes, finding purchase in the deep snow, her breath coming in white clouds that trailed behind her like prayers made visible. Behind her she heard the wolves' song grow louder, more frenzied, the sound of a pack that had cornered their prey and were moving in for the kill. She crested a small rise, and the scene unfolded before her like a nightmare given form. In a clearing below, a man lay collapsed in the snow, a spreading stain of crimson beneath him, stark as a wound against the white. His horse lay nearby, dead, its body torn open, entrails steaming in the frigid air like smoke rising from a campfire. The horse's eyes were already glazed with death, its spirit departed for whatever place horse spirits went. Circling the man were 4 timber wolves, huge animals that must have weighed 90 or 100 pounds each. Their gray forms moving like smoke, like death itself given solid form. The lead wolf, the alpha, was massive, its shoulders nearly as high as a man's waist. They were magnificent and terrible apex predators, doing what nature had designed them to do, what they had to do to survive the harsh winter. But the man was still alive, still trying to drag himself away with his arms, one leg clearly mangled and useless, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. He had a revolver in his hand and was firing, the sharp reports echoing across the clearing, each shot making the wolves dance back but not flee. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the hammer fell on empty chambers with an impotent click. He was out of ammunition, out of options, out of time. His face was pale with blood loss and shock, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The alpha wolf, reading the situation with the intelligence of its kind, gathered itself to lunge, to go for the killing bite to the throat that would end this quickly. Natóyi-nii'tákim didn't think, didn't plan, didn't weigh options. She simply reacted, moving on instinct and training, cupping her hands around her mouth and releasing a piercing eagle cry, the call her people had used for centuries to communicate across vast distances, to warn of danger, to rally in battle, to strike fear into enemies. The sound cut through the air like a blade, sharp and shocking in its suddenness and intensity, utterly foreign to this moment. The wolves froze, their heads snapping toward her, startled by the unexpected sound. Their yellow eyes evaluated her, calculating, assessing this new element in their hunt. This was not the behavior of normal prey. This was something different, something potentially threatening. She cried out again, louder, advancing down the slope with her knife drawn, waving her walking stick above her head, making herself appear larger, more formidable. She had learned this from Natóyi-nii'tákim, who had learned it from her grandmother. When facing a predator, you do not show fear. You do not act like prey. You become the predator yourself in spirit, if not in body. She began to sing a song of power that Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her, words in the old language that spoke to the spirits of wolf and bear, asking for safe passage, for mercy, for understanding. The song acknowledged wolf as elder brother, as hunter, as necessary part of the great balance, but also claimed her own power as human, as medicine woman, as one who walked with the spirit's blessing. The words flowed from her without thought, rising from somewhere deep inside, where the old knowledge lived. Grandfather Wolf, I honor you, I see you in your power, but this one is under my protection. I claim him as my brother. I ask you to release him. Find other prey, grandfather. The spirits will provide. The wolves watched her, confused by behavior that did not match their expectations. Prey ran. Prey cowered. Prey smelled of fear and weakness. This human was advancing, was singing, was claiming spiritual power. The wolves were not particularly superstitious, but they were intelligent and pragmatic. They had already killed the horse, had meat available. This injured man would be a difficult kill with this strange human defending him, especially now that the man had stopped bleeding as heavily, was no longer as close to death. For a long suspended moment, the outcome hung in balance. The wolves could easily kill them both if they chose. Even with her knife, even with her courage and her songs, she was no match for 4 healthy wolves, working together in perfect coordination, centuries of hunting wisdom guiding their every move. But these were wild wolves, not starving, desperate ones. They had options. They had already fed somewhat on the horse. And there was something about this human's bearing her voice, her absolute lack of fear smell, that gave them pause. The alpha made the decision with a sharp bark that communicated to the pack. As one, they melted back into the forest, their forms disappearing into the shadows, like spirits returning to the spirit world. They didn't go far, Natóyi-nii'tákim knew. They would watch from the tree line, waiting to see if she would leave, if the man would die, and provide an easy meal without a fight. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. She had bought them time, though she wasn't sure how much, or what she would do with it. Natóyi-nii'tákim slid down the embankment into the clearing, her eyes never leaving the tree line where the wolves had disappeared, her body positioned between them and the injured man. "Don't move," she commanded in English, her voice sharp with authority. "The bleeding must be stopped first, or you will die before they return." She knelt beside the man, quickly assessing his injuries with the practiced eye of a healer. His left thigh had been torn open, the wound deep and ragged, the kind made by powerful jaws and sharp teeth designed to tear flesh from bone. One of the wolves had gotten hold of him and shaken, trying to dislocate the joint, bring him down. Blood was pumping from the wound, with each heartbeat too much blood, too fast. The snow around him was crimson in a widening circle. He was already pale, his lips taking on a bluish tinge that spoke of shock and blood loss. Without immediate intervention, without stopping the bleeding, he would be dead in minutes. She had seen men die from such wounds before, had watched life leave their eyes while she tried frantically to save them. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the result of years of treating injuries both in peacetime and in the violent days before the final defeat of her people. She packed moss into the wound, cold weather moss that grew on the north side of trees, that Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her had natural antiseptic properties that would help clean the wound while providing pressure. She used strips torn from her wool skirt to bind it tight, making both a compress and a tourniquet, using a stick to twist the binding tighter, cutting off the blood flow to the leg. It was rough field medicine, brutal, but necessary. The man cried out in pain as she worked, a raw animal sound that spoke of agony beyond words, but she couldn't afford to be gentle. Speed was more important than comfort right now. She needed to stop the bleeding, needed to get him warm, needed to prevent shock from killing him before the wolf wounds could. Shock was as deadly as blood loss, she knew. The body's system shutting down from trauma, the spirit beginning its journey to the afterlife, even while the body still technically lived. "What is your name?" she asked in English, needing him to stay conscious, to keep fighting, to hold his spirit in his body. "Tell me your name." Stay with me, Daniel, he gasped, through gritted teeth, his face contorted with agony, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Daniel. Blackwood. The name struck her like a physical blow. Blackwood. The same name as the timber baron who wanted her land, who was destroying the forest, who represented everything that had taken her people's world away. But this man looked young. Perhaps 30 winters. Far too young to be Victor Blackwood, who was old in his 60s. Son, perhaps nephew. Some relation that carried the cursed name, but she pushed the thought away. He was injured. He was human. He was under her protection now. Whatever his name, whatever his family, he was a person in need of healing. That was all that mattered in this moment. The old law, the law Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her, was clear: the healer serves all who need healing without exception, without prejudice. To do otherwise was to betray the medicine, to lose the spirit's blessing. I am Natóyi-nii'tákim, she told him, working as she spoke, checking for other injuries. I am going to take you to my home. It is not far, but you must help me. Can you stand? He tried pushing himself up with his arms, his face determined despite the pain, but his injured leg wouldn't bear any weight. He collapsed back with a cry of pain and frustration, fresh blood seeping through the bandage. Leave me, he said, his voice weak, but determined, his gray eyes meeting hers with the acceptance of someone who had faced death and made peace with it. You'll die trying to save me. The wolves will come back. You should go. Save yourself. I'm done for anyway. I do not leave the wounded, Natóyi-nii'tákim said firmly, putting into her voice all the authority of generations of healers, all the power of the medicine knowledge she carried. That is not my way. That has never been my people's way. Now put your arm around my shoulders. We will do this together or not at all, and I have not come this far to fail. She was strong, strengthened by years of physical labor, chopping wood and hauling water, tanning hides and gathering plants, doing all the work that had once been shared by many hands in a traditional camp, but now fell to her alone. But Daniel was a big man, well over 6 feet tall, solid with muscle, and he was dead weight, unable to help much, with his injured leg dragging uselessly. Together they made agonizing progress. Her arm around his waist, his arm over her shoulders, both of them stumbling through the snow, half carrying, half dragging him through the drifts. Behind them she could hear the wolves still following at a distance, still watching with patient hunger. They knew that time was on their side. The man was losing blood, weakening with every step despite the tourniquet. Eventually he would fall and not rise again. Then they would have their meal. They could afford to be patient. But Natóyi-nii'tákim was patient too, and determined with a strength that came from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. She sang as they moved, singing the old songs of strength and endurance that Natóyi-nii'tákim had taught her, songs that connected her to all the women of her line who had faced hardship and survived, women who had birthed children alone in the wilderness during harsh winters, women who had walked hundreds of miles when forced from their lands, women who had endured unimaginable loss and continued living. She thought of Natóyi-nii'tákim, who had buried 4 of her 6 children, yet continued teaching, continued healing, continued honoring the medicine. She thought of Omoxi-Puma, who had watched her people's world destroyed, yet had continued to weave and cook and tell stories, preserving what could be preserved. She would not fail now, would not let this man die, would prove that even in this diminished world the old ways still had power, the medicine still worked, kindness still mattered. The journey that normally took her 15 minutes stretched into an eternity. Each step was a battle against snow and weight and exhaustion. Each yard gained was a victory celebrated only by continuing forward. Daniel was growing heavier. As he weakened his breathing more, labored his skin colder despite the exertion. She could feel the warmth of his blood seeping through the makeshift bandages, could smell its copper tang mixing with the clean scent of pine and snow. The storm she had sensed was closer. Now the sky dark as evening, though it was still morning. The first flakes were beginning to fall, gentle scouts before the army to come. Soon it would be a full blizzard, whiteout conditions, where you couldn't see your hand before your face. They needed to reach shelter soon. Finally, her cabin came into view through the tree's smoke rising from the smoke hole where she had banked the fire before leaving. Never had it looked so beautiful, so welcoming. It was safety, warmth, survival. She all but fell through the door, with Daniel barely managing to guide him down beside the fire, rather than simply dropping him in a heap. The wolves had followed them right to the clearing's edge. She could see their shapes moving in the darkening forest, could hear their occasional howls growing more urgent as the storm approached. But they would not approach the cabin. Some ancient treaty between human and wolf, some understanding written in blood and respect over countless generations, kept them from crossing that boundary. Animals understood the territory of humans, respected it, even if they didn't fear humans themselves. She barred the door with a heavy wooden beam and shoved a chest against it for good measure, though she doubted the wolves would try to enter. Then she turned her full attention to Daniel, to saving a life she wasn't even sure was worth saving, given his surname, but which demanded saving nonetheless, because that was what healers did. The cabin was cold, the fire having burned down during her absence. That would have to wait. First, she needed to truly assess and treat his wounds to determine if he would even survive long enough for warmth to matter. She knelt beside him and cut away his trouser leg with her knife, revealing the full extent of the damage. It was bad. Worse than she'd initially thought in the chaos of the clearing. The wolf had nearly severed the muscle, exposing bone in places. The amount of blood loss was critical. She could see it in his color, in the rapidity of his breathing, in the way his eyes couldn't quite focus. He was teetering on the edge of shock of death. She needed to work fast, and she needed to work perfectly. She heated water quickly, adding sage and other cleansing herbs to the pot hanging over the resurrected fire, muttering prayers as she worked. While the water boiled, she stripped away his outer clothing with efficient movements, checking for other injuries. Scratches covered his arms and torso. He had fought well, had not gone down easily. There was a gash on his shoulder she hadn't initially noticed, but nothing else as severe as the leg wound. When the water was ready, she began to clean the wound, thoroughly removing all traces of dirt and debris, and wolf saliva that could cause infection. Infection was as deadly as blood loss in these mountains, where doctors were distant, and the new medicines the whites talked about were unavailable. She had seen men survive terrible wounds, only to die days later as their flesh rotted as fever consumed them. Daniel was conscious, but barely, his eyes unfocused with pain, and shock, his breathing shallow and rapid. She gave him a thick stick to bite down on, Pono Ka Omita's war stick decorated with notches for his victories and coups, then poured her precious whiskey directly into the wound, flooding it to kill any contamination. His scream echoed through the small cabin, raw and primal, and he nearly bucked her off despite his weakness, but she held firm with surprising strength. She needed to ensure the wound was as clean as possible, that no corruption remained to poison his blood. The wound must be pure before she could begin the true healing. Once cleaned, she applied a thick poultice made from yarrow and comfrey plants she had gathered and dried the previous autumn in anticipation of need. Yarrow was a powerful wound healer, able to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Comfrey helped tissue repair and reduced inflammation, knitting flesh back together. She had seen these plants save lives that the white doctors, with all their modern learning, had given up on. The plants had their own spirits, their own intelligence. If you asked them properly, if you honored them, they would share their medicine. As she worked, she sang softly healing songs Su-yi, Nixokoi had taught her. Songs in the old language that called upon the spirits of the plants, asking them to share their medicine with this wounded man. Songs that had been sung over the wounded for generations beyond counting. Songs that carried the accumulated power of all the healing that had come before. The whites called this superstition primitive magic with no scientific basis. But Natóyi-nii'tákim knew better. The songs were not just spiritual, they were practical. The rhythmic singing calmed both healer and patient. Regulated breathing created focus and concentration. It lowered the heart rate, which reduced blood loss. And whether or not the spirits actually heard and responded, and she believed they did, had seen too many miracles to doubt, the intent mattered. Healing was as much about will and hope and connection as it was about medicines and techniques. She wrapped his leg, carefully securing the poultice with clean cloth she had woven herself. Then she covered him with blankets and the best buffalo robes she had, needing to combat the shock that had set in from blood loss and cold. She built up the fire until it roared, filling the cabin with warmth and light that pushed back against the darkness gathering outside as the storm arrived in earnest. Only then did she tend to her own needs, realizing she was shaking. Whether from cold or the aftermath of fear or simple exhaustion, she wasn't sure. Perhaps all three. She made tea from willow bark and other herbs for pain and to calm the nerves. She forced herself to eat some pemmican, knowing she needed strength for what lay ahead. She would need to watch him constantly for the next day at least, fighting to keep him alive through the critical hours. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness through the rest of the day and into the night. Each time he woke, she was there, giving him water mixed with healing herbs, checking his bandages, making sure his breathing remained steady. She brewed strong bone broth from elk bones she had saved, coaxing him to take small sips, knowing he needed nourishment to replace the blood he had lost, to give his body the fuel it needed to heal. As night fell completely, and the storm she had sensed earlier arrived with full fury, wind shrieking around the cabin corners like lost spirits, snow piling against the walls, with audible thuds, she settled into a vigil beside him. She had done what she could with her medicine, and her skills had called upon the plant spirits and the Creator for help. Now she could only wait and watch, ready to intervene if fever set in or bleeding resumed. She studied the man she had saved, seeing him clearly for the first time in the firelight. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two younger, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors rather than in an office. His face was strong-featured, with a firm jaw and high cheekbones, handsome, despite the pallor of blood loss and the grimace of pain. His hair was brown, with hints of gold, shorter than Ponokamita's, had been cut in the white man's style. His hands, when she examined them, were calloused, but well kept. The hands of someone who worked, but took pride in their work. He was wearing clothes of decent quality, not rich, but not poor either. In his pockets, she had found a surveyor's compass and measuring tools, a notebook with sketches and calculations done in neat handwriting, a tintype photograph of a woman and infant child, both smiling stiffly as the photographer required. No wedding ring, but the photograph suggested there had been family somewhere sometime. Perhaps lost as she had lost hers. Perhaps that was another thing they had in common besides survival and the randomness that had brought them together. Who was Daniel Blackwood, and what was his relationship to Victor Blackwood, who wanted her land, and what cruel twist of fate had brought him to her of all people? She had saved the life of someone whose family was trying to destroy her, to take the last piece of her world. Was this the Creator's joke? Some kind of test? A lesson she was meant to learn? As if sensing her scrutiny through the haze of pain and fever, his eyes opened gray as storm clouds, trying to focus on her face with visible effort. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough and weak, barely more than a whisper. "Why?" "It is what I do," Natóyi-nii'tákim replied simply, reaching for the water skin to give him another drink. "I am a healer. I could not leave you to die, even though—" He paused to catch his breath, each word, clearly an effort. "Even though you don't know me, even though saving me put your own life at risk with the wolves and the storm." "Life is sacred," she said, holding the water skin to his lips, helping him drink. "All life given by the Creator. That is what Natóyi-nii'tákim, my grandmother, taught me. To honor it, to preserve it when possible, to fight for it even when the odds seem impossible. The medicine knowledge I carry is a gift meant to be used, not hoarded. To refuse to help when I have the ability would be to break sacred trust." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face as she had studied his gray eyes, more focused now, despite the pain etched around them. "You're Blackfoot," he said, not a question, but an observation spoken without judgment. "Peekani Blackfoot," she confirmed. "Natóyi-nii'tákim, my grandmother, was a medicine woman known among our people. My mother was Omoxi-Puma. I am Natóyi-nii'tákim, last of my line-keeper of their wisdom. That must be." He struggled for words through the pain and weakness. Difficult. To be the last. to carry all that alone. She smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it, only the acknowledgement of hard truth. It has its challenges, but the knowledge must be preserved. Someone must remember how the plants heal, how to sing the old songs, how to walk in both worlds. If I don't carry it forward, centuries of wisdom dies with me. I understand, Daniel said softly, and something in his eyes, a depth of pain that matched her own, told her he truly did understand loss and responsibility, and the weight of being a last remnant of something larger. Rest now, she said gently, adjusting the buffalo robe around him. You have lost much blood. Your body needs all its strength for healing. Sleep is the best medicine now, better than anything I can give you. The wolves, he murmured, his eyes already starting to close, despite his attempt to stay alert. They killed my horse. She was a good horse. Had her for 5 years. Her name was Sarah, after my sister. Loyal, strong, never let me down. Didn't deserve that end. To die like that. Animals hunt to survive, Natóyi-nii'tákim said, echoing what she had told herself earlier in the clearing, the teaching Natóyi-nii'tákim had given her. The wolves were only doing what their nature demands, what the Creator designed them to do. They are not evil, only hungry, only following the path laid out for them. It is the way of the world, the great balance. Death feeds life. Life feeds death. The circle continues. Still, his voice was fading, sleep or unconsciousness claiming him. Hard to bear, watching her die. Knowing I couldn't help her, couldn't save her. She screamed. Horses scream when they're dying, did you know that? It sounds almost human. Yes. Natóyi-nii'tákim agreed quietly, her own memories rising unbidden. It is always hard to watch death, even when we understand its necessity, even when we know it is natural and inevitable. The heart grieves what it loves, regardless of understanding. Daniel's eyes closed fully and his breathing deepened into sleep, though whether it was true healing sleep or the unconsciousness of blood loss and shock, she couldn't yet tell. She would watch and see. Natóyi-nii'tákim sat back, pulling her own blanket around her shoulders. She would not sleep deeply tonight, needing to wake periodically to check on her patient, to make sure his breathing remained steady, that fever didn't set in, that the bandages didn't need changing. The storm raged outside, wind howling like angry spirits, snow piling higher and higher against the cabin walls. She could hear trees cracking in the distance, their branches giving way under the weight of ice and snow. It was the kind of storm that killed the unprepared, that buried travelers and froze the careless. But inside it was warm and safe. 2 survivors, sheltering together against the cold and dark. 2 people from different worlds, brought together by chance and need, and the random violence of nature. Natóyi-nii'tákim looked at the man sleeping by her fire, and wondered what the spirits had intended by bringing him to her. Nothing happened by chance, Natóyi-nii'tákim had always said. Everything was connected, part of a great pattern too vast for human minds to fully comprehend. Every meeting, every event, every seeming coincidence was actually part of a design, a teaching, a step on the path the Creator had laid out. Perhaps this was her test, her opportunity to prove that grief had not destroyed her capacity for compassion. Perhaps this was the Spirit's way of reminding her that she was still needed in this world, that her medicine still had value and purpose. Perhaps it was a way to test her adherence to the healer's oath. Would she save even the life of someone whose family threatened her? Or perhaps it was simply what it appeared to be, a man in need of help, and a woman with the skills to provide it. Sometimes Natóyi-nii'tákim had also said the simple answer was the true one. Not everything needed to be a profound lesson or a spiritual test. Sometimes a wolf hunt was just a wolf hunt, a storm was just a storm, and a person in need was simply that, a person in need. She rose and checked his bandages one more time. The bleeding had stopped, thank the Creator and the plant spirits. His color was still pale, but no longer the deathly gray it had been when she first found him. His breathing was steady and regular, not the shallow gasping of someone sliding toward death. His skin was cool but not cold, clammy, but not with the death sweat. With vigilance and care and perhaps a bit of luck or spiritual favor, he would survive. Natóyi-nii'tákim returned to her own sleeping mat, pulling the blankets around her but positioning herself where she could see Daniel clearly, where she could wake if he called out or if his condition changed. She had pulled her mat closer to the fire, giving him the spot she usually occupied, the warmest spot in the cabin. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the storm outside, and the crackling of the fire within, both sounds ancient and primal reminders that despite all the changes the modern world had brought, reservations and lumber, mills, broken treaties, and slaughtered buffalo, the fundamental realities remained. Winter, cold, the need for shelter and warmth, the vulnerability of flesh to harm, the power of one human helping another, the thin line between life and death that all creatures walked regardless of race or history or conflict. Some things would never change no matter how much the world transformed around them. Natóyi-nii'tákim slept but lightly, her medicine woman's senses alert, even in rest, for any sign that her patient's condition was changing. The storm continued for 3 days and 3 nights, one of the worst blizzards the mountains had seen in years. Snow piled 6 feet deep in places, covering everything, transforming the world into an unbroken white wilderness where landmarks disappeared and familiar places became alien. The wind screamed continuously, a sound that got inside your head and made you wonder if the cabin could withstand such fury, if the logs would hold or splinter, if the roof would stay or blow away. But the cabin held as Pono Kaumita had built it to hold, strong and true, respecting both the old ways and the new techniques. The walls did not shudder. The roof did not leak. The smoke hole drew properly, pulling smoke up and out while keeping the worst of the wind at bay. They were safe within its walls, even as nature raged outside, with a kind of power that reminded humans of their smallness, their dependence on shelter and wisdom and luck. During those 3 days and nights, Natóyi-nii'tákim tended Daniel with constant, unwavering care. She changed his bandages twice daily, checking for signs of infection, the redness, the heat, the smell of corruption that meant the flesh was dying. She kept him warm with buffalo robes and carefully tended fire. She kept him hydrated with water mixed with healing herbs. She fed him broth made from elk bones she had been saving, building his strength, gradually giving his body what it needed to make new blood to heal the terrible wounds. When fever came on the 2nd day, as she had known it would, fever was the body's way of fighting, of burning out corruption. She was ready with cooling compresses made from snow and herbs, with fever-reducing teas made from willow bark and elderflower. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, kept him from becoming too hot, kept the fever from climbing to the point where it could damage his mind or his spirit. Daniel drifted in and out of delirium during the fever's height, speaking in fragments that painted a picture of his life, of the burdens he carried. He called out for someone named Mary, his voice full of pain and love and regret. He spoke to a child named Sarah, apologizing for not being there, for failing her. He muttered about measurements and boundaries and disputes over land, about his father's obsession and his own guilt. Natóyi-nii'tákim learned much in those delirious ramblings, piecing together a story that was both foreign and familiar. Daniel was indeed related to Victor Blackwood, his nephew, son of Victor's dead brother. He had been raised by his uncle after his parents died, had been taught the timber business from childhood. But he had chosen a different path, becoming a surveyor for the territorial government, rather than joining his uncle's company. There was clearly tension there, conflict between duty to family and personal conscience. He spoke of his wife Mary and daughter Sarah, lost to cholera 2 years past while he was away mapping the northern territories. He had returned home to find them already buried, denied even the chance to say goodbye, to hold them one last time. The grief in his voice when he called their names was raw and familiar, still fresh, despite the time that had passed. It was the same grief she carried for Pono Kaumita and Nii'tákim, the same grief of those left behind, those who continued living when part of their heart had died. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. Daniel woke clear-eyed and lucid, weak as a newborn but rational. Natóyi-nii'tákim was dozing in her chair beside him when his voice brought her fully awake. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse and dehydration. 3 days, Natóyi-nii'tákim replied quickly, assessing him. His eyes were clear, focused properly. His skin was cool, the fever gone. His color was better, some life returning to his face. There was a fever, but it has passed. Your wound is healing well, no sign of corruption. You will live, I think, though you will carry scars. He looked down at his bandaged leg, flexed his foot, experimentally winced at the pain, but nodded with satisfaction that he could still move it. You've been caring for me all this time, alone. There is no one else, she said, simply helping him sit up slightly, propping him with furs and rolled blankets. I live alone here. Have lived alone since the fever took my husband and daughter 3 winters past. Your husband. He looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. The photograph on the altar. The man's tools carefully maintained the sense of absence that filled the space. I'm sorry. What was his name? Natóyi-nii'tákim, she said, and speaking his name aloud to someone else for the first time in months felt both painful and healing, like pressing on a bruise to test if it still hurts. He was Blackfoot, like me, a good man, a skilled hunter, a loving father. And our daughter was Natóyi-nii'tákim. She was 6 summers when the spotted sickness took them both within days of each other. Understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared loss that needed no further words. They were both members of the club no one wanted to join, those who had lost their families, who carried that particular grief that never fully healed. I'm sorry, Daniel said, and the words carried weight, because they came from someone who truly understood, who had walked the same dark path. My wife was Mary. My daughter was Sarah. Cholera while I was away, mapping the Northern Territories for a railroad survey. I came home to find... He stopped, unable to continue, the memory still too sharp. You need not speak of it if it pains you, Natóyi-nii'tákim said gently, knowing that some wounds, even old ones, were better left unbandaged. Actually, Daniel said slowly, it helps. To speak their names out loud. To acknowledge they existed, that they were real, that they mattered. Most people don't want to hear about the dead. It makes them uncomfortable. They want you to move on, to forget, to act as if grief has an expiration date. Natóyi-nii'tákim understood completely, painfully. After Natóyi-nii'tákim and Natóyi-nii'tákim died, people had stopped mentioning their names, as if pretending they had never existed would somehow ease her pain. The settlers avoided her even more than before, and the few Blackfoot who still visited did so with awkward sympathy, but no real conversation about loss. It had only made the loneliness worse, had made her feel like she was the only one who remembered, the only one who still cared. Tell me about them, she invited, settling cross-legged on the floor beside his pallet, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. If you wish to speak, I will listen. In my culture, we speak the names of the dead to keep their spirits close, to honor their memory. Silence does not serve them, and so Daniel spoke haltingly at first, and then, with growing fluency, about the woman he had loved and the child they had created together. Mary had been a schoolteacher's daughter from Ohio, educated and refined, but with a spirit of adventure that had led her west, when most women of her background would have stayed safely in civilization. She had loved music, playing the piano whenever she could find one, singing, as she worked around their small house in the territorial capital. Sarah had been born during the hardest winter Daniel could remember, arriving a month early during a blizzard that kept the doctor from reaching them. Mary had labored alone with only Daniel to help her, and together, terrified but determined, they had brought their daughter into the world. Sarah had been small but fierce, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray eyes. For 2 years, she had been the center of their world, filling their home with laughter and chaos and the particular joy that only children bring. Then Daniel had accepted a surveying contract in the Northern Territories, mapping new railroad routes. The money was good, the work important. He would be gone 3 months, maybe 4. Mary had encouraged him to go, saying they would be fine, that she had friends and neighbors. 3 months, Daniel. We'll manage. You'll be home before you know it. But the work had taken longer than expected. Communication was spotty in the remote territories. And then, in the 4th month, cholera had swept through the territorial capital, brought by travelers from the east. In 2 weeks, it killed hundreds. Mary and Sarah had been among the first to fall ill. By the time Daniel made it home, summoned by a telegram that took weeks to reach him, they were already buried in the cemetery on the hill. Their graves marked with simple wooden crosses, their house sold to pay debts. All their possessions scattered or sold. Even their photographs were gone except for one tintype he carried with him always. I should have been there, Daniel said, his voice breaking despite the 2 years that had passed. I should have been able to protect them, to care for them, to at least hold them as they died, and tell them I loved them one last time. The cholera does not care about should, Natóyi-nii'tákim said quietly, reaching out to touch his hand in comfort. It takes who it takes, randomly, cruelly. You could not have stopped it. You might have died with them if you had been there. Then who would remember them? Who would speak their names? Maybe, he said, but she could hear he didn't believe it, that he still carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. But I could have been there, could have had those last moments, those last words. Instead, they died with strangers in a hospital ward, and I wasn't there. That's the hardest part. Not the death itself. I know death comes to everyone. But being robbed of goodbye, being denied that closure. Yes, Natóyi-nii'tákim agreed, feeling the truth of it resonate in her own grief. That is the hardest part. Not the death, but how it happens. Whether there is time to prepare to speak what needs to be said, to release each other with love, rather than have them torn away suddenly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two wounded souls sharing space and understanding, finding unexpected comfort in the presence of someone who truly comprehended the particular weight they each carry. Outside, the storm had finally broken, and weak winter sunlight was filtering through the smoke hole, painting everything in shades of silver and gold. "Why do you live out here alone?" Daniel asked eventually, his voice stronger now, more present. "It must be difficult, dangerous. Why not go to the reservation with the rest of your people?" Natóyi-nii'tákim considered how much to tell him. But something about this man, perhaps their shared experience of loss, perhaps the intimacy that came from caring for someone in their most vulnerable moments, made her feel she could trust him with truth. "The reservation is not a place of life," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "It is a place of slow death of spirits, broken of people forced to abandon everything that made them who they are. My people there are forbidden to hunt, forbidden to hold our sacred ceremonies, forced to farmland that will not yield crops. They are dependent on government rations that rarely come and are often spoiled when they do. They watch their children taken away to boarding schools where they are beaten for speaking our language, where their hair is cut, where they are taught to be ashamed of being Indian." She paused, gathering herself. "I could not bear to see that, could not bear to be part of that slow destruction. Here, at least, I am free. I can practice the old ways, keep the medicine knowledge alive, honor Natóyi-nii'tákim's teachings. I can speak our language, sing our songs live, according to the values I was raised with." And she continued, her voice softening, "Here, Ponokaomita and Niitsi-kaki-aki are still with me. I feel them in the land, in the trees they loved, in the river where we fished together. Their spirits walk here. How could I abandon them to live among strangers on land that means nothing to our people?" "You can't," Daniel said gently, "and you shouldn't. Your grief is yours to carry in the way that makes sense to you. No one has the right to tell you otherwise." "And yet," Natóyi-nii'tákim said with a bitter smile, "the government and your uncle both believe they have exactly that right. They want this land. They want me gone away to the reservation where I can be controlled and forgotten. Your uncle has sent his men here 3 times to threaten me, to try to force me to sell." Daniel's face darkened. "My uncle," he said, and there was a complexity of emotion in those 2 words. Love and frustration and shame and anger, all mixed together. He has become obsessed with owning everything, controlling everything. It wasn't always this way. When I was young, he was different. Still ambitious, but with some measure of conscience. But after my aunt died, and his own children rejected him, he turned all his energy to the business, to accumulation. Nothing is ever enough. He always wants more." "Does that include you?" Natóyi-nii'tákim asked, watching his face carefully. "Are you here on his business? Were you surveying this land for him, preparing the way for him to take it?" Daniel met her eyes directly, and she saw honesty there and pain. "No. I was surveying for the territorial government, mapping the region for official records. My uncle. We don't speak much anymore. I refuse to join his company, refuse to participate in some of his more questionable land acquisitions. He sees that as betrayal. I see it as maintaining some shred of ethics. He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured leg. I know what he's done to the forests, to the land. I've seen the destruction. It sickens me. But he's family, and the situation is complicated. He raised me when my parents died, gave me education and opportunity. I owe him for that. But I don't owe him my soul, and I won't help him destroy what's left of this wilderness. Natóyi-nii'tákim studied him, trying to judge the truth of his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that not all white men were like his uncle, that some could see beyond profit to the value of the land itself. But she had been disappointed before, had trusted before, and been betrayed. Pretty words, she said carefully, but what do they mean in practice? If your uncle sends his men here again to force me out, will you stand with me, or with your family? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with the question, understanding its weight. I will stand with what is right, he said finally, and what is right is that this land is yours, has been your family's since long before any white man came here. My uncle has no claim to it except greed, so yes, I will stand with you if you'll let me. Not because I'm trying to earn your forgiveness or prove something, but because it's the right thing to do. We shall see, Natóyi-nii'tákim said, not quite willing to trust fully, but allowing the possibility. For now you need to focus on healing. You are not strong enough to stand with or against anyone. You will need weeks, maybe months, to fully recover. Then I guess I'll be imposing on your hospitality for a while longer, Daniel said with a slight smile, the first she had seen from him. It seems so, Natóyi-nii'tákim agreed, finding herself returning the smile despite herself. Try not to be too much trouble. More days passed. As Daniel's strength slowly returned and the worst of winter set in, they fell into a comfortable routine born of necessity and proximity. Natóyi-nii'tákim tended the fire-prepared meals, changed his bandages, and administered her medicines and healing teas. Daniel, once he could sit up, properly began helping with small tasks he could manage from his pallet, mending tools, carving new utensils from wood. She brought him organizing supplies, repairing clothing. They talked during the long winter evenings when darkness fell early, and there was nothing to do but tend the fire and pass the time. They shared stories of their lives, their losses, their hopes and fears, and the uncertain futures they each faced. Daniel spoke of his work surveying the territories of the vast wild spaces that were rapidly being divided and claimed and destroyed. He spoke of his uncertainty about his purpose now, his struggle to find meaning after losing his family. Natóyi-nii'tákim shared stories of her childhood, of learning the old ways from Natóyi-nii'tákim, of the ceremonies and traditions that connected her to generations of ancestors. She spoke of the pain of watching her culture slowly vanish, of being caught between two worlds, of the constant struggle to hold on to identity, in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate, to surrender, to forget. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Daniel asked one evening, as they sat by the fire, him in his pallet and her in her chair, both of them working on small tasks, him carving a spoon, her sewing moccasins. "Going to live with your mother's people, who are still free up in Canada, away from the reservation system?" "Entirely." Natóyi-nii'tákim was quiet for a long moment, her needle pausing in its work. "I have thought about it," she admitted. "There are still some bands in Canada that live in the old ways, though even there the pressure grows. But the journey would be long and dangerous, especially in winter. And," she hesitated, "and you'd be leaving them behind," Daniel said softly, understanding without needing explanation. "Ponokaomita and Niitsikaki. Yes, here I can visit their graves, can speak to them, can feel their presence. How can I leave them? They are all I have left." "Not all," Daniel said gently. "You have your medicine, your knowledge, your purpose. You have the land itself that you protect. And," he hesitated, then continued, "and perhaps you have the possibility of new connections, new people in your life, if you allow it." Natóyi-nii'tákim looked up, meeting his gray eyes across the firelight. There was something there, a possibility neither had spoken aloud, but both felt growing between them. Two broken people finding comfort in each other, finding that perhaps they weren't as alone as they had thought. But she was not ready to name it, not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, the grief still too present. It felt like a betrayal of Natóyi-nii'tákim to feel anything for another man, even though she knew intellectually that he would want her to be happy to live fully, rather than just exist in the shadow of loss. "Perhaps," she said, finally returning to her sewing, "but for now I am content with the present. Each day is enough without worrying about what might be." If Daniel was disappointed by her non-answer, he didn't show it. He simply returned to his carving, the only sound the crackle of fire, and the wind outside, comfortable silence stretching between them. As the weeks passed, and January turned to February, Daniel progressed from sitting to standing with support, and finally to taking tentative steps around the cabin. With the help of a crutch, he carved himself. His leg was stiff and painful, the muscle damaged, but it bore his weight. He would walk with a permanent limp, but he would walk. He would recover, though he would carry scars both visible and hidden for the rest of his life. "I should leave soon," Daniel said one morning in early March, though there was no conviction in his voice. "Return to my work. I've imposed on your hospitality too long already." Natóyi-nii'tákim felt a strange tightness in her chest at the thought of him leaving at the cabin, returning to its former silence. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to having someone to talk with, to the cabin feeling less empty and less haunted by absence. But she said, "Only you are welcome to stay until your leg is stronger. The journey to town will be difficult as it is. No need to make it harder by leaving before you're ready." "Thank you," Daniel said, his gray eyes warm with something that looked like relief. "You've been more than kind, more than I deserved, certainly. A stranger who brought nothing but trouble to your door." "You brought company," Natóyi-nii'tákim replied softly. "That is not nothing. These walls have been very quiet for a very long time." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of connection, of loneliness, recognized and shared, and perhaps eased. Neither spoke of it directly, but it hung in the air like smoke from the fire, visible but intangible, real but unspoken. That afternoon, while Natóyi-nii'tákim was outside gathering firewood, she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders moving purposefully through the melting snow. Her hand went to her knife as she turned to face them, her heart sinking. She knew who this would be. 5 men emerged from the tree line, led by Wade Carson, Victor Blackwood's foreman. The others were hired guns, rough men who did Blackwood's dirty work. All were armed with rifles and pistols, a show of force meant to intimidate. "Natóyi-nii'tákim," Carson said, his tone falsely friendly, though his eyes were cold as the winter they'd just survived. "Been a while since we visited. Thought we'd check on you, see how you made it through that bad storm." "I survived, as I always do," she replied coldly, her hand tightening on the knife handle. "I told you before, my land is not for sale. Leave now." "Now that's no way to be neighborly," Carson said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood's made you a very generous offer. $500 for this patch of dirt. More than any Indian land is worth, truth be told." "This land is not dirt," Natóyi-nii'tákim said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "It is sacred to my people. It holds 7 generations of my family, and I will not sell it to a man who destroys the forest, who poisons the rivers, who cares only for profit, and nothing for the land that sustains all life." Sacred Carson laughed mockingly, and the men with him joined in cruel sounds that echoed across the clearing. "It's trees and rocks and dirt, woman. Nothing sacred about it. And it's sitting right in the path of progress, right where Mr. Blackwood needs it for his next expansion. You're standing in the way of civilization, of jobs and prosperity. People in town are starting to resent you for being so stubborn." "Let them resent," Natóyi-nii'tákim said, her voice hard. "I will not move. Not for money, not for threats, not for your false idea of progress that leaves nothing but destruction in its wake." Carson's expression hardened his pretense of friendliness, dropping away like a mask. "You're a stubborn woman, I'll give you that. Stupid, but stubborn. Mr. Blackwood tried being reasonable, tried being generous, but his patience has limits. You understand what I'm saying?" "Are you threatening me, Mr. Carson?" Natóyi-nii'tákim straightened her hand, moving toward the knife, her body tense and ready. "I'm advising you, Carson," said his voice low and menacing, "for your own good. Accidents happen in these mountains all the time. Cabins catch fire. Lone women disappear. Indians get moved to reservations whether they want to go or not. The Indian agent is a reasonable man who understands where his salary comes from. One word from Mr. Blackwood, and you'll be on the reservation before spring thaw. She's not alone. The voice came from the cabin doorway, strong and steady. Daniel stood there leaning heavily on his crutch, but upright, and alert, his presence solid and unexpected. In his free hand was Natóyi-nii'tákim's Winchester rifle, pointed steadily at Carson. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Carson said, though his eyes flickered with uncertainty at this unexpected development, at the complication this represented. "Any threat to this woman concerns me," Daniel replied calmly, his voice carrying authority despite his weakened state. "Now I believe she asked you to leave her property. I suggest you do so immediately." "And who are you to give orders?" Carson demanded, though there was less confidence in his voice now. "Daniel Blackwood," Daniel said, and watched with satisfaction as the name registered, as Carson's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, calculation. "Victor Blackwood's nephew, and I'm prepared to ride into town today and file an official report with the territorial marshal about attempted intimidation and coercion if you don't leave this property immediately." The mention of his relationship to Victor Blackwood, combined with the threat of official involvement, gave Carson visible pause. Victor's operations, profitable as they were, couldn't afford too much scrutiny from territorial authorities. There were already questions about some of his logging practices, about how he had acquired certain land parcels, about workers who had disappeared after speaking up about unsafe conditions. "Mr. Blackwood will hear about this," Carson said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "About you being here, about you interfering. Family or not, you're making a big mistake." "The only mistake," Daniel said coldly, "would be you remaining on this property 1 minute longer. Leave. Now." Carson and his men exchanged glances, then turned their horses. But before leaving, Carson looked back at Natóyi-nii'tákim with undisguised malice. "This isn't over, medicine woman. One way or another, Blackwood gets what he wants. He always has, he always will. You're just delaying the inevitable." The 5 men rode out, but their presence had poisoned the afternoon. Natóyi-nii'tákim stood watching until they disappeared into the trees, her heart pounding with delayed fear and anger. "Thank you," she said to Daniel as she returned to the cabin, finding him lowering the rifle with a grimace of pain from the exertion. "But you should not have involved yourself. Your uncle is powerful, vindictive. You've made an enemy today." "I've had that enemy my whole life," Daniel replied wearily, hobbling back to his pallet. "I just usually try to avoid direct confrontation. But I couldn't stand by and let them threaten you. Not after everything you've done for me. And besides," he paused, meeting her eyes, "this is wrong. What my uncle does is wrong. I've known it for years, but didn't want to admit it, didn't want to face the conflict. But seeing it directly, seeing him target you specifically, I can't pretend anymore." "Still," Natóyi-nii'tákim said, helping him sit, "this is my battle, not yours. You don't owe me this, is it?" Daniel asked quietly. "Just your battle. You saved my life, Natóyi-nii'tákim. That creates a bond, a debt I can never fully repay. But more than that." He hesitated, then continued, his voice soft but determined. "I've been here 2 months now. In that time I've come to respect you, to value your company, to care about what happens to you. So maybe it is my battle too, if you'll allow it to be." Natóyi-nii'tákim met his eyes, seeing sincerity there, and something more. Something that made her heart beat faster, that reminded her she was still alive, still capable of feeling things beyond grief and determination. Something that both frightened and attracted her, like standing at the edge of a cliff looking down at deep water, the fear of falling mixed with the temptation to jump. "I do not know what to say," she admitted quietly, feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't since Ponokaumata's death. "Then say nothing for now," Daniel suggested gently, his hand reaching out to briefly touch hers, a gesture of connection and possibility. "But know that I'm here, and I'm on your side, for whatever that's worth. And I'm not going anywhere until I'm sure you're safe from my uncle's scheme." That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Natóyi-nii'tákim found herself studying Daniel's profile as he carved a new spoon from a piece of cedar. His hands moved with precision and care, the blade shaving away thin curls of wood that fell into the fire, where they briefly flared with aromatic smoke before becoming ash. He had clever hands, skilled hands, the hands of someone who could create as well as measure and map. She had been alone for so long, had convinced herself that she preferred solitude, that she needed nothing and no one beyond her memories and her medicine and the